Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on democracy. My name is Barbara Walsh, and I chair the board at the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. And today's webinar is being hosted by the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation with the John and Pat Hume Foundation. To all of you from across Ireland, from across Europe and wider, you're really welcome. We're delighted that you're with us today for this important discussion and this important topic. This webinar was born out of a fundamental concern really for the erosion of democracy, really due to the polarization of politics, and also sometimes the capacity for all of us to live in our own media bubbles and to only listen to what is being said to like-minded people. 2022 is a significant year for Ireland. It's the 100th anniversary of the Civil War that divided us, and it's also the 50th anniversary of Ireland joining the European Union. That has been significant for us in many different ways. For one thing, it has introduced us to a wider European community, and also it framed the Good Friday Belfast Agreement in 1998, which has put the island on the road to peace. As we begin this discussion today, I'd like to acknowledge a man, a quiet, insightful, very wise man, Fergus Armstrong, who really supported the development of this work. And he used to say, we'll wake up some morning and we'll wonder what happened to democracy because what we valued and fought for is gone. So in collaboration with the Hume Foundation, we found a partner of like mind who believes, like Glencree, that diversity is a strength, it's the essence of humanity, and that dialogue, leadership for peace, education, and public discourse are fundamental tenets of a vibrant democracy. Glencree itself was established in 1974 as a response to an outbreak of violent conflict in the north of the island. It was born itself out of the Civil War and had a strong resonance with a lot of the people who set it up in 1974, who felt that they wanted to make a contribution to peace on the island. John and Pat Hume, as all of you know already, lived in the midst of violence all their lives and mayhem, and charted a consistent path for peace, sometimes which was far from easy. The Hume Foundation itself is developed and was set up in their honor to honor their vision and their mission. Today, we're really fortunate to have really informed speakers, again, from across the world on this important topic. And they're moderated today by Tony Connolly, Europe correspondent with RTE, that's our national public broadcasting service. And if you want to hear a bit more about Glencree, go to glencree.ie or to thehumefoundation.org. I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this event, and we are coming to today against an extraordinary backdrop of geopolitical tension, national political crisis in the UK, I suppose. And whereas in the past, a lot of these major geopolitical events would have unfolded in a particular sphere of international negotiations, commentary and press reporting. These days, as we all know, these geopolitical crises are unfolding through social media. They are dispersed and disseminated in a completely novel and radical fashion. And it's arguable that this new platform of social media has, in some senses, helped to polarize the political discourse. And that's a subject that we will obviously get into a lot today. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the John and Pat Hume Foundation and the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation. We were due to open the event with the Vice President of the European Commission, Vice President for Democracy and Demography, Dubravka Suisa, but unfortunately she's been tied up at the General Affairs Council here in Brussels. So she is going to be Her place will be taken by her head of cabinet, who is Colin Scicluna. He is a senior Maltese diplomat. He was director and deputy managing director of the Middle East and North Africa at the EU's External Action Service, at the EU's diplomatic arm from 2016 to 2019. He was previously Maltese ambassador to the United Nations in New York and ambassador to Austria. I'm also delighted to welcome Timothy J Schaefer. He's a PhD associate professor at the Department of Communication Studies. He's also a director at the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy and director of Civic Engagement and Deliberative Democracy at the National Institute for Civil Discourse. Dr. Schaefer specializes in the advancement of democratic practices by focusing on deliberative democracy and civic education, concentrating on the role of professionals in settings such as higher education, NGOs, and government. He's published numerous articles on deliberation, higher education, community development, and civic life. I'm also delighted to welcome Sue Moore, who is the Chief Executive of the Joe Cox Foundation. Before joining the foundation in 2019, she worked across a variety of industries, including the arts, charities, media, and sports organization, including roles at the British Council and London 2012. Outside of the foundation, she's a trustee of the Bishopsgate Institute in London. You're all very welcome. And just before I introduce Colin Scicluna to give the opening address, just to remind people of some of the reasons why we're here. The Joe Cox Foundation, of course, was founded after Joe Cox was murdered on the 16th of June 2016 on her way to a constituency surgery meeting in Batley and Spen. More recently, the Conservative MP Sir David Amos was murdered on the 15th of October 2021 after he was stabbed several times at his constituency in Essex. Not forgetting, of course, during the long troubles in Northern Ireland, 4 members of Parliament, an Assembly member, and a number of local councillors were murdered during that tragic period. So, in some senses, the sharp end and the violent end of a breakdown in political courtesy is not entirely new, but I think it has reached certainly new levels in recent times for various reasons, which we'll get into. I'm delighted now to introduce Colin Scicluna to give the opening remarks. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks to yourself, to the Glencree Foundation and to the Hume Foundation for inviting us to participate in this event. First of all, I want to convey the regrets of the Vice President for not being able to be herself in this meeting. But as you mentioned, she's held up in the Council. But thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to, in the first instance, to deliver the speech that she was going to be, the message that she was going to be delivering on her behalf. We find this invitation to be very, very timely to discuss strengthening democracy and reconciliation through ethical and respectful political discourse. This subject is gaining in importance across the European Union and indeed across the world. The need for ethical and respectful political discourse concerns all of us. Respectful discourse knows no borders, has no political party affiliation, and is intergenerational. The responsibility for a lasting, ethical, and respectful political discourse lies with each one of us. A whole of society approach is required to get this right, and we must get this right. If we want to leave a democracy to future generations that is worthy of the name, then ethical and respectful discourse must lie at the very heart of this ambition. This will help guarantee that we make our democracy fit for the future. The Vice President herself was once a mayor. She started out her political career, in fact, as a mayor. And she was mayor of Dubrovnik, which is a city in Croatia. And she became mayor in 2001 when the city was still feeling very much the impact of the war that had ended just a few years before. She would have shared her experience in rebuilding Dubrovnik's infrastructure, hotels, roads, schools, to the extent that now this is a well-developed and highly popular tourist destination. But this meant that after such a traumatic period, that it was important to build bridges within the community, within the various parts of society, to be able to guarantee that there was not only to rebuild the city, but to ensure that the rebuilding of the city would be durable. As mayor, the vice president had established the first ever children's council, which kicked off a tradition of child participation in decision making. And this was a very good example of how innovation is important and how embracing new tools can help us to improve our democracy. Of course, new technologies provide opportunities for a liberal democracy, like e-governance, virtual dialogues with citizens, dialogues like this one itself, of course. But technology also amplifies certain risks, like disinformation and polarization. So one way to strengthen democratic resilience is to engage with citizens using those technologies in a way that is constructive and inclusive. The Conference on the Future of Europe, which we are very much in the midst of at the moment, does this by using a number of tools, which include a multilingual digital platform where citizens of the European Union can engage with one another, can share ideas in all 24 official languages of the European Union. The third plenary of this conference took place just last weekend in Strasbourg. And it's, of course, significant that this was a city that John Hume knew very well as a member of the European Parliament himself. And he often used its location as a bridge between France and Germany to illustrate the potential within each of us to bridge differences and to overcome conflict. One of the quotes, one of the things that he is renowned for saying was that the difference is the essence of humanity, and the answer to difference is to respect it. He said that this was a fundamental principle of peace, and the Vice President certainly agrees with this approach, and believes that the respect of difference is a fundamental principle of democracy, because without this kind of respect, it's impossible to engage with one another. We cannot understand the spectrum of political positions on any number of topics if we cannot accept and respect difference. How could politicians and citizens engage with each other if they are not prepared to listen to different points of view? Humanity, in all its diversity, is, above all, one. This idea of oneness was in fact highlighted at a very special moment during this plenary this past weekend, when for the first time ever in a setting of this nature, a single representative spoke on behalf of Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox churches. An ethical and respectful political discourse underpins the work of the conference. And this was a very powerful example of how this is happening in practice. It's the aim of the conference to bridge the gap between citizens and politicians, between citizens and their democracy. And last weekend, we brought together citizens from every corner of the European Union to deliberate on the future union that they would like to live and work in. Of course, there were many Irish citizens and decision makers who were also present, members of Parliament from Ireland, members of the European Parliament, of course, but also citizens. The Vice President is a co-chair of the conference, and she chaired the parts of the plenary and participated in the working groups on behalf of the European Commission. And at this plenary, we took stock of 90 recommendations on 4 topics that were presented by European citizens' panels. We also considered recommendations from the Belgian, Dutch, French, and German national citizens' panels. As I said, there were 4 topics discussed. Under the first, the European democracy, citizens delivered a clear message. The recommendations stated a need for citizens' assemblies to be integrated into policymaking in the European Union. They said very clearly that they believe that the embedding of deliberative democracy in the European Union will enable citizens to contribute actively to the future European Union. Indeed, some of the citizens asked why this is not happening at the national level. Now, of course, we know that Ireland was in fact a trailblazer in this some years ago, with the various deliberative assemblies and the referenda that were organized to resolve issues of national importance. And in fact, in this European exercise that we are doing, we have drawn a great deal of inspiration from the experience that was gained through the Irish example. The second set of recommendations was on values and rights, the rule of law and security. And here there was a general convergence on the need for a common understanding of European values. And I think that the main subject matter of today is one that fits very comfortably at the very center of this debate on European values. Another set of recommendations that was presented was on climate change and the environment, where a number of innovative proposals were submitted to tackle the common challenges that we all face. And the last of the panels that was of the set of recommendations that was presented was on health, where, of course, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but not only, there were a number of calls for us in Europe to be doing far more together and to be more effective in dealing with a number of the challenges that are felt in the health sector, notably in the context of mental health. Across all these 4 topics, citizens referred to the democratic environment and what they believe is needed to make it stronger. Overall, we believe that the plenary debates and the deliberations went very well. We still have another 2 panels that need to finish their work. And in fact, the panel on a stronger economy, social justice, jobs, education, culture, sport, and digital transformation, so a very broad remit there, will be taking place in Dublin Castle on the 25th to the 27th of February. So we're all looking forward to enjoying Irish hospitality next month. The conference itself is highly innovative, and where necessary, we need to continue to be innovative in an attempt to make discussions more dynamic and more interactive. The Vice President commented herself about the fact that it was quite impressive to stand in the hemicycle in Strasbourg, and for a change, not to be surrounded only by politicians, but to have a very strong presence of citizens, and citizens who were completely representative of the European Union, randomly selected, aged from 16 to 85, from all sorts of backgrounds and walks of life, and 1/3 of them being young people aged between 16 and 25. All of them have taken on the responsibility of participating in the conference, and they have been very well prepared. Even those who were skeptical at the beginning are feeling the unique responsibility of participating in such an innovative exercise. They are seizing this unprecedented opportunity for their voice to be heard. The citizens' recommendations are at the very heart of the conference, and we will be ensuring that these recommendations will feed directly into the final outcomes of the conference. This conference is unprecedented in its scale and its ambition, and good deliberation takes planning. It requires the utmost respect of civility. It's a process that requires reflection, respect, and the willingness to learn more about a wide variety of topics, but also about ourselves and about one another. It transcends borders and languages, cultures and histories. And very importantly, deliberative democracy takes time, because it's not only about forming opinions, it's an opportunity to engage with one another, to listen, and to come together in a safe, transparent, and inclusive process. The conference itself is underpinned by a charter, and this charter ensures that the exchanges in the context of the conference are respectful, that there is a political discourse that can contribute to the vibrancy of democracy. A respectful and ethical political discourse helps to reach better decisions and the results for everyone, based on evidence and not emotions. Respectful political discourse helps build mutual understanding of existing differences and helps keep the exchange constructive. Given the importance of this, the European Parliament, the Council, and the Commission have established this charter, to which all participating institutions, organizations, and individuals have to explicitly commit themselves to. With this in mind, the Vice President would have concluded her address by asking a question to her co-panelists, my co-panelists, and citizens who are joining us here today. Would such a charter be required at the political level in Europe? And do we think that this is something that could be promoted and could be helpful in encouraging a more constructive approach to our political life and democracy? And if yes, should we do this at a national level, at the European level, or is it something we could do at both of those levels? With that, I thank you very much for the opportunity and look forward to the debates to follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. Just before I go, just going to explain the nature of this charter again, so people are familiar with how it would work, what it is exactly.
Well, the charter is a declaration of a series of principles, where essentially, while we want as open an exchange as possible and an inclusive exchange as possible, there are a number of ground rules, and those ground rules include that we are respectful of one another, that that there is no hate speech, that there is no picking on specific topics to the detriment of one participant or another. So it's a series of actually rather straightforward principles. But in fact, it has been a very useful tool, because every now and again we have had participants both on the multilingual digital platform, but also in the citizens panels who are, let's say, flirting with the edge of the limits imposed by this charter. And we use the charter as a way to say, look, we need to make sure that this exchange takes place within these parameters. And ultimately, so far, there were no examples where we had to be stronger than that. But I think it was very important to keep the debate on a certain level and to ensure that that things didn't descend into exchanges which would not have been particularly helpful.
Okay, thanks very much. Just to remind people, please do contribute to the debate. We'd love to hear your questions and comments. You can put them in the chat box there on the side of the Zoom panel. I'd like to introduce Sue Moore now, if you don't mind. Sue, would you care to just pick up on some of Colin's thoughts there? Sue, of course, is the Chief Executive of the Joe Cox Foundation. Let's hear from Sue. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Colin, and thank you, Tony. That was a really informative opening for us. There were 4 key things that I picked out there that have a real crossover with the work that we're doing at the Joe Cox Foundation. And the first of those was what you said, Colin, at the very beginning, which is that this impacts all of us and we all have a responsibility. I think it's, it's emboldened for all of us to make sure that we don't just leave it to the people in charge, that actually everyone has a role in making sure that we treat each other respectfully. I think that's very interesting what you were saying there about the charter, that we all have to be civil to each other to have that greater impact. The second point I picked up on was talking about positive use of social media. And I'm sure that in our discussions today, we will talk about where there are negative implications of social media. And we certainly have many examples of where use of social media has had a very negative impact on politicians in the UK. But there are also examples of where it can have some positive outcomes. And I know that one of the problems that a number of politicians in the UK have expressed is that they like the more direct opportunities to interface with their constituents and to hear about the problems and therefore to find solutions. And so they don't want to come off social media completely, but obviously it does bring the problems of abuse and intimidation with it. I was also really interested in the points about respecting difference, and something we talk about a lot at the Joe Cox Foundation is how we have lost the ability to disagree agreeably. And again, that does in some parts come down to social media, that it's very easy to have a sort of a very binary view when you're talking in 140 characters. You're not really able to show nuance of thought. But I think it is really important that we try and recover that opportunity for debate between us all. And one of the things that it would be interesting to discuss is encouraging politicians to work cross-party. And that was something that Jo Cox was a really firm believer in. And she actually was only in Parliament for a year, but during that time she worked with Conservative politicians on issues as diverse as Syria and on loneliness, and found that actually to have the biggest impact, that was the way to do it, was to find friendships and work with other politicians. And also my final point that I was going to reflect on was about the sort of the bridging of divides between citizens and politicians. And I think there's a really interesting point here about political education in general, that what I found as we've worked on this issue is that there is a really big gap in education of what generally people understand that their elected officials do. People don't understand necessarily what MPs do. I think they certainly don't understand what local government do. And that means that there are gaps there that people, if they misunderstand, they take their queries to the wrong place, for example, and that's when they get cross. That's when it escalates to abuse and intimidation sometimes. So I think there's a role not just in schools for political education, but something that all of us can commit to learning more about how political systems work, and therefore what our role in that is.
Thank you very much, Sue. A lot of very interesting points there, which we'll come back to shortly. I mean, I think the whole question of social media and the rise of populism is incredibly fascinating, but also extremely complicated and complex. And we'll get into it as much as we can, but it may be beyond the scope that we have today. But on that note, I'd like to introduce Timothy Schaefer from the United States. He's done a lot of work, of course, on civic discourse and democracy. Delighted to have Timothy along. Timothy, I guess when we talk about polarization in politics, we need look no further than January the 6th last year, and whether that represents some kind of low point in the slide into polarization and division. And I suppose, I don't know where your starting point would be, but we can think back to the 1970s and Newt Gingrich perhaps bringing about a much more caustic discourse, much more competitive discourse compared to the kind of collegiate approach of Congress. And then, of course, you had the deregulation of broadcasting in America, which brought in the shock jocks. And a lot of people trace the current climate politically and online back perhaps to those origins. I don't know where your starting point would be, but delighted if you can respond to Colin's remarks and just let us know your general vantage point.
Yeah, no, and great questions, and I'll respond to those in just a second. Just want to say thank you to the opportunity to be here as well. It's a real treat, but also one of those moments that we have to recognize kind of what brings us to a point of talking about the state of democracy and some of the situations that I'm involved with right now. In fact, I'm part of an international project called the Varieties of Democracy, and we're finishing up the last data point for this last year. You can find it VDIM. We can share it publicly. Every country for the last 100+ years, some even longer, but talking about these long trends of democratic practices in the formal spaces, as was being mentioned by Sue, talking about politicians in elected office, but also in all the kind of multiple levels of the civic life. And we can see in recent years, and especially in the United States, the real concern that many people have had before January 6th, what gets exacerbated in that moment, and honestly, what has come since then, and in certain ways, some camps have heightened this as a real dramatic point, kind of the alarm bells, so to speak. The guardrails of democracy have been written about by a number of people are there. And at the same time, the real concerns about some others kind of downplaying some of this. And I think it speaks to this larger sense of how do we think about this at multiple levels? How do we think about this in the formal and informal spaces? And I should note, part of my affiliation and the work that I do with the National Institute for Civil Discourse, similar in some fashion to the Joe Cox Foundation, was established after Representative Gabby Giffords was shot in January, actually, of 2011, as she was trying to meet with constituents in front of a local shopping store. And 18 people were shot, 6 people were killed. Representative Giffords made it through with kind of an amazing transformation, but still the residual effects of this, what at that time was being talked about as this utter extreme of political discourse and what it meant in real life for the concern of saying an elected politician in the United States to not be able to show up and actually speak to the people that they represent in the US Congress was this a real alarm bell. So the Institute has its origins in that moment. And I think in some ways it has only continued to kind of erode as we were talking about the social media landscape. I mean, there's been a tremendous research in that area. In our book, A Crisis of Civility, a couple years ago, we have some really good essays within it related to that. I'm thinking particularly just on point as some of us were talking earlier. Shannon McGregor wrote an article a few years ago about how social media has become also this platform for thinking about public opinion. And so it's not only become this place for this kind of extreme kind of rhetoric, the kind of bombs at one another, but it's also becoming this way in which we perceive the views of those around us. And so it's created a bit of a hurdle for us to actually see those who have differences. And as we said at the beginning, if diversity is a strength for democracy, we need to be able to recognize that and be able to engage that in some way. And this is, for me, why civil discourse or civility becomes so important. But there are different levels we can think about that. There are weak notions and stronger notions. The kind of politeness is essential, but there's a robustness underneath that. If we don't have the opportunity to actually get to that place, then even those kind of thinner notions of being able to just in a basic way talk to one another is a real problem and challenge. And so, as I was, listening to the remarks at the beginning, and then Sue, your comments in response there, I think that the notions of education being really important here, awareness of what is and isn't happening, what gets kind of trumpeted and amplified is the language that a lot of people use in kind of particularly the social media space, is that we create these kind of pseudo events, right? There's this recognition that this is a mediated kind of platform and reality. And so we have to navigate that in a way that is appropriately kind of corresponding to that. The problem is we don't necessarily interpret it as such. We just take it as either face value, whether we're talking about COVID or otherwise, and people fall into these camps. At the heart of a lot of this is, and this will be maybe my last point here, is a phrase called affective polarization. And this is something, as you were, Tony, as you were talking about Gingrich and others, I was just mentioning, in fact, yesterday with some of my students that I teach. They are in their 20s. They are undergraduate students, at least the language that we use here in the States. And the entirety of their lives have only been within this kind of deep divide of politics in the United States. The early 90s were really that transformation when we see a lot of this kind of break apart to where Gingrich and others kind of found that there was a real strategic benefit and a motive to not be kind of functional in certain ways, right? The idea of the collaboration, the kind of collegial environment that existed for older politicians. We'll take the current US President, Joe Biden, for example, when he kind of has these recollections of the earlier times in the Senate, for example, when these people would get together, they'd have their debates on the floor, and then they would literally get together for dinners with their families because they would all be in DC and such. Those just don't exist for a bunch of reasons. One, plane flights are a lot easier, so people go home. They're not living in these places, so they don't have those kind of necessities. But the system, it benefits. So the shock jocks and everything else, Donegal Young has a great book called Irony and Outrage, and why we see this amplification of this just spin out in all sorts of ways. So we are having really different ways of being and existing, the sources of information that we have. And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to, I think, these problems that get exacerbated by individuals who are interested in, say, power over these kind of democratic practices in the United States. And so you have the January 6th kind of moments that erode the trust in the systems. And as we realize, democracy is when people believe in this work together, kind of the collaboration and the ownership of it, the challenges that are embedded within that. But fundamentally, if we believe in that as a system of practice and of life, that affords something. If we lose that, then we realize these constitutions and these statements and things become little more than something on a document. So this is, for me, one of the really big challenges that we have to confront is how do we reinvigorate some level of trust and commitment to democracy, not just in some philosophical way, but in a real, practical, and lived way.
Thanks very much, Timothy. A really fascinating introduction there from you. An awful lot to digest. Thanks very much to everyone for your comments already. First one from Paul O'Dwyer there, talking about the Northern Ireland Peace Programme and his experience in the South in the Department of Finance. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but just the initial hostility and caution and I suppose suspicion between both the North and South with that peace money, how it sort of eroded over time and people were able to work with goodwill. One or two comments about the charter that Colin mentioned, a lot of interest in that. But I suppose an inevitable question there from, if I can find it, it's all very well having a charter, Colin, but we do have a problem with the rule of law in the European Union at the moment. If we're asking citizens and politicians to be courteous and polite and to abide by certain norms of discourse. We also have allegedly governments who don't abide by the rules in the European Union and are holding up a lot of things. How do you square those particular disconnects, Colin?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge that the European Union can build a set of norms, but doesn't always have the means to enforce those norms. To be able to do that, we have to make sure that all parts, that all institutions are working together and making sure that that the different parts can work well together. In the context of values, rule of law, etc. We've started in the European Commission a series of rule of law reports, and this is the very beginning of a process which hopefully can develop into something which can be more enforceable, can set a standard that will be observed by all member states. However, in this context, as with many others, there is very often the need to work by consensus, where all member states need to agree on not only on what the standards are, but on how to act upon those standards. Of course, consensus is a very polite way of saying that everyone gets to have a veto, and that by definition means that there are limits to the way that we can take things forward. Now, I think what we are trying to do, including by using the Conference on the Future of Europe as a means of reaching out to citizens, is to bridge that gap. And Sue very rightly referred to education, and I think education and communication, which in fact are very closely linked in terms of raising of awareness, are extremely important. And it's very interesting that one of the things that we hear time and again is, why are our children not being taught about Europe and about European values in schools? They are learning about values, they are learning about their own history and the history of their own country, but they're not learning about what it means to be European. Many of us involved in this call, in this meeting, would describe ourselves as being wherever we come from, and would probably be comfortable saying that we are European, but it will be very difficult to explain what that European part of our identity means. And I think it's because we don't have enough of a discussion, an ongoing discussion at all levels and in all contexts about what this really means. And it is linked to what you said, what you mentioned about rule of law, about respect, about rights, about liberties. These are all things which fit into what we call the European way of life. And I think it's important that when we talk about this set of values, we can explain better not only what the values mean, but what we aspire to achieve as a result of applying those values. And I think we have a number of good examples even from the very recent past, because if you take the way that the reaction to COVID was, at the very beginning, it was everyone for themselves. But as soon as the different member states of the EU started working together, started helping one another, started showing solidarity to one another, things started moving very fast and very effectively. If we look at the way that vaccines were available across Europe, for the smaller member states, I come from the very smallest of them all, it would have been impossible to make sure that we would have got the amount of vaccines we needed on the open market, because we would have been outbid by those who are buying far bigger consignments. So the fact that Europe took a common approach on something both as practical but also as life impacting as this, shows that if you have this principle of solidarity, of respect, of helping out one another, that you will ultimately be stronger and you will be able to come out of a crisis even stronger. Another good example of it is the latest budget that the EU has adopted, which we call Next Generation EU. For the first time ever, the European Union will be able to borrow on the financial markets, because the challenge is that big that we need to have a budget that is big enough to be able to overcome the difficulties that we had. And to do that, we needed to have an agreement of all member states, including those who tend to be more frugal, who also tend to be more prosperous. But they needed to show solidarity towards those who are less prosperous and who are less perhaps in a position to deal with this exacerbation of difficulties that the pandemic brought about with it. So again, a demonstration of solidarity, of understanding for the situation that each member state finds itself in, each society finds itself in, and at the basis of it is these values, this identity that we need to be able to form together.
Okay. Thanks very much, Colin. I mean, I guess the idea of a set of European values that might be taught at school, I don't know if you were intending that might become something directed from EU level. You could imagine the hail of controversy that might provoke in some countries, but we can maybe set that aside for one moment. Sue, can I go back to you again? How would you assess the kind of climate of political discourse in the UK, especially at this very heightened political moment in Westminster since Joe Cox's murder back in 2016? Do you think it has got better or worse? And if worse, I mean, what do you think is really driving the climate that we're in at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would say worse, definitely. And I think I'll refer to some research that Carnegie UK have recently put out, where they said from their polling that 76% of people in England don't trust MPs. And then when asked what the biggest threat to democracy is, people said at the top of the list was loss of trust in government, and that came out as 32%. So, that is a significant problem. If 76% of people don't trust the people that are elected to represent them, we've got a big issue to tackle here. And I think there are lots of things at play. I mean, I think one of them is obviously that politics have become more polarized. Brexit has obviously pushed people into one of two camps where they possibly were not before. And I think that what we need to do more of is as I referenced before, was take Joe's example of finding ways of working across party divides, but also finding ways to work across the divides that have been caused by Brexit, but also by the extreme polarization in views that people have taken around COVID and the response to COVID. So I think I'd like to go back also to one of the things that Tim said that I've written down in big letters on my piece of paper here. Is it's about trust and commitment to democracy. And trust is easy to lose and very hard to win back. But there has to be some work done, I think, around building that trust back up. And I think one of the things that it's important to remember is that, if you look at Westminster, we have 650 MPs there, many of whom are doing incredible work with their local constituents, and they genuinely care. That's why they went into politics. And I think most people, if you went out and said in the street, how many MPs can you name? People might be able to name a couple of cabinet ministers, maybe one member of the shadow cabinet. But actually to remember the good stuff and to remember that there are those MPs. And that was something that people said a lot about Sir David Amess when he was murdered, was that he was a really good constituency MP who really cared about the people he was representing. So I think finding some ways of talking about the good stories and the good people who are involved and really care, I think is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to the question of trust, and maybe Timothy might want to come in here, is the fact that the financial crisis was probably a watershed moment because it damaged so many people's lives, and yet the big institutions, the big powerful entities in democracy seem to survive, having perpetuated a lot of the problems. So people lost trust in governments, they lost trust in banks, institutions, and people have said that loss of trust continued up to the present moment with COVID, and that's perhaps explaining why so many people don't trust vaccines or don't trust big pharma or whatever. I mean, do you agree with that assessment, Sue? And it seems such a huge thing to try and overturn because it's so vast.
Yeah, it's definitely a big thing to overturn, and I think you're right that it's not just trust in government that we're thinking about here. It is trust in wider institutions. So yeah, I think we need to think about the ways that we can make small actions to break down what is such a mammoth task. It's one of those things that if you try and find one solution, it sort of overwhelms. But I think, yeah, trying to find ways of earning back that trust, and it's definitely going to take time. I think that's an important thing to consider as well.
Timothy, what's your view of the level of trust of politicians in America? I mean, in some ways, politicians almost need to go to the extremes or closer to the extremes to energize their base, to get people out to vote, you know, to electrify voters, and that's why you've had these wedge issues and you know, really difficult polarizing issues that have dominated the political space in America.
Absolutely. In fact, I was just taking a quick look. The Pew Research Center does a lot of wonderful polling, particularly in the United States. And there's one, it's a little bit dated from last year, but I think it speaks to this. Public trust from the late 1950s to 2021, the high point was in 1964. And since then, we've been on decline, kind of up and flow, up and down, but mostly down. And to the point to where, in this 2021 survey, the people who trust that government in Washington, so our national kind of federal government, is doing what is right, is just about always 2% of people, or most of the time about 22%, right? And so that has largely held steady since then. So I think this sense of trust is a really significant thing. And I think, Tony, what you were just highlighting is a perfect example. People often have views about their own members of Congress, you know, equivalent to MPs and the like. And so they feel good usually about them. Everybody else is kind of doing the wrong thing, which is a real problem, which is, you know, one of the reasons having some level of proximity and understanding what is, as Sue was noting, what's actually going on, what are individuals able to do at different levels is a really significant sort of thing. And if I can say as a slight kind of note, I know a local member in the state where I live currently, a representative who speaks to this. He's actually a conservative, he's a Republican, a rather conservative individual. And he says, I'm really aghast at this kind of extreme that we're seeing in the rhetoric, people like at that time, President Trump. He's like, but I can't publicly talk about that because I want to be reelected because I'm really concerned about things like the budget. And otherwise, he's a fairly fiscal sort of guy, and he wants to be in that position. It really hates kind of the extreme rhetoric, but he recognizes he can't, nor does he really want to, speak up in some of those ways, which I think highlights one of our problems. It's kind of this, has been written about here, this kind of two-party doom loop, right? It's this cyclic pattern that just, it keeps circling, and until we can kind of break out of that cycle, there are too many incentives to stay there rather than step out of that. So that's one of the things to note. And the other piece is, and I wish I should have said it earlier, because I think it really highlights, I think, some of the positives, because there's a whole tenor of this that can feel like awful, right? And in a lot of ways, it can be very challenging, is that many expressions of democracy can happen and is happening at the local level. So there are lots of experiences, some in the United States, across the EU, even in the UK and around the world, things like citizens' juries, what we talk about as mini publics, so very small kind of representative groups and the like. Some of this has been done pretty extensively, actually. I think you're all doing a lot better than we are maybe here in the States in this regard, but like some of these experiences can be hyper-localized, but it gives people a better sense of what does it actually take, right? Because it turns out politics is a little bit difficult to get to a place of agreement on what's this collective thing, even if it's something rather small about some public park or the like at a local level. Those things cost money and obligations. We can only have so much bandwidth, as was being mentioned earlier. I think Colin was speaking to this, right? Some of the ideas of how do we think about budgets and the scale and the possibilities? Well, we have a lot of limitations. So for people to recognize that and understand that is a really important thing. But the appeal of the extreme, I think, is a real significant thing. And I was trying to watch some of the comments in the chat as well. And I'll speak from the US, and then I will stop here, is one of the big challenges is, particularly in the United States at this moment, is not just polarization. We are deeply polarized on all sorts of things. That affective polarization I was mentioning is very real. It corresponds to what vehicles you drive, where you shop, what you wear, all of what you watch, all this sort of stuff. The real challenge, in my view, and from lots of scholars, is we need to do a much better job of speaking about those who are committed to democracy and those who are not. And so I think not just in the United States, but elsewhere, this is a real challenge and question. How do we not simply fall into, as we see, right, this sense of like, well, here's somebody on the left, so we need somebody on the right, or vice versa. But where are those boundaries that we say this is in play? This is what it takes to live in a pluralistic, liberal, democratic society. And are you on the fringes of that? We recognize that always will exist, but how do we tamp some of that down through the processes and the commitments to democracy? That trust, part of, back to that point, the erosion of that trust is if we kind of look at that and feel like we're so disconnected from kind of those politicians and that political life that it almost doesn't matter. Strikingly, a few years ago, there were a handful of surveys that said, I could live in an undemocratic society if I still had the level of economic prosperity and other things, kind of the life I want to lead. I'd be okay with a more authoritarian kind of model or regime. That's really concerning, right? And so this is the kind of slow creep and appeal that some express in books like How Democracies Die and the like, that I think are warranted. And we see the 2016 election, we see Brexit as these moments, these indications of the real troubles. So it's not an absolute abandonment of our systems, but I think it is legitimately a moment to say, what are we doing? What is happening? And this needs to happen at multiple levels, not just how people perceive their politicians and the like. So it's that education piece, but not just that, but it's also how do we encourage them? And I apologize, I said I was going to stop a moment ago, but if I could say this last little bit, that this is the professor in me, is this sense of, at the National Institute, we're working with state legislators, for example, a project called Next Generation, to where we literally get them in the room, no press, nobody else, nothing against the press, but like they talk a little bit differently when they're just them, and to say, how do they function? Because a lot of them also, they express this, those extremes exist, but that's usually the ones who want to be on TV or be interviewed and kind of documented in those ways. Most are fairly functional kind of folks, really interested in governance questions. The challenge is, how do you do that when honestly that doesn't get you the sound bites or the clips or the funding? And we've seen this with Anthony Fauci here in some of his hearings when he's speaking to some of our senators, and he I think rightfully has noted, he's like, you're raising funds for your next campaign off of comments that I'm making, and you're lobbying these sorts of attacks. That's not a good indication of a functioning democracy, in my view. Not to sound too partisan, but like that's where I think we have to think about those parameters and what does it take to be committed to democracy and not simply be interested in having those kind of positions of power or authority.
Okay, thanks, Tim. There was a question in from Tim Kirk, who has asked, directed at you, how would you advise progressive Americans to engage constructively and respectfully with the Republican Party, which has become hostage to Trump? I'm not asking you to identify yourself on the political spectrum, but I think you've probably answered, I mean, at lots of levels, including the local level. So I hope, Tim Kirk, you were happy with Tim's answer there. Let me just go back to Colin again, back to the European political space. We talk about social media and its very corrosive effects, but social media isn't just people who have views that you don't have and who might express them in a very combative, bellicose kind of way. Social media is also weaponized by Russia. I think that's sort of fairly established, to undermine the West in America and in Europe. I mean, how does the European Union deal with that particular problem?
I think we've certainly in the last few years increased the efforts to deal with disinformation. And because clearly there is the weaponization that you mentioned, but it's not only at the level that you're referring to, that where you have the Russias of this world and others who try to use this in a way to destabilize the very political foundation on which our something like the European Union is constructed upon. But it's happening also at various different levels. I mean, as was mentioned in the speech I delivered on behalf of the Vice President, technology and social media is something which is intrinsically a good thing, but it can be manipulated and used in a way which is certainly not so good. And we've seen how Timothy mentioned Brexit, mentioned the election in the United States in 2016. I mean, we all know the Cambridge Analytica phenomenon, where social media and information gathered on social media was manipulated in a way that had a determining impact on the democratic process. So the problem there is not with democracy. The problem is with those who manipulate the very freedom that democracy provides. And I think we have. We see that in Europe, right? And I think in some respects it is getting to be rather similar to the situation in the United States, that this extreme polarization, and it's a polarization which exists on both sides of the political spectrum, is becoming more entrenched, and we find it increasingly difficult to fill the gap in the middle. You rarely hear terms like bipartisan anymore. You don't hear so much about politicians who reach across the aisle anymore. It seems to have become far more important to wear a badge and defend that badge to the bitter end. And where it becomes problematic is that this is having an impact on citizens, on individuals, and is reflecting on how they vote, how they express their vote. There is nasty politics, but it doesn't mean that all the people who are voting for the so-called nasty politicians are nasty people themselves. So why are they turning to these alternatives? And the reason, as Sue was mentioning, is because of the erosion of trust in institutions and in the institutions that are supposed to guarantee those liberties to those citizens. So I think that the very first thing that we need to do, that we as institutions, as politicians who want to defend democracy, as it were, is to find ways to restore that trust. Sue mentioned that it's very easy to lose it and very difficult to gain it back. But we need to really look at how we're going to gain it back. And I think that the only way we can do that is through education, as we've mentioned, but it's through engagement. It's through telling people that you have something to say and we want to listen to it. Because at the root of many of these political movements and the attraction of this undemocratic alternative is the fact that people feel that they're left behind, that they're ignored by the system, they're ignored by the institutions, and we need to reverse that. We need to come back to a situation where people feel that they are being represented and that their priorities, their views are accurately being represented. And sometimes it's not really about taking on board everything that people are asking us to take on board. Sometimes it's also about explaining why we're not taking on board, but taking the time to do that.
Okay, thanks, Colin. I just want to go to a couple of questions now, and thanks again for everyone for their questions and comments. There's a question from Elizabeth Healy, I think picking up on a question from Adrian Pan, and this is a very good question, and I'd like to put it quickly to you, Colin, and then to Sue. Is dialogue enough to bridge the gaps when social and economic inequality is increasing? In other words, we've had these, astronomical gaps in wealth, in income equality, and if you're at the bottom of the heap, I mean, your predilection for being polite may not be what it should be. Just briefly, Colin, is that a major challenge for this particular conversation?
I mean, of course it is. I mean, there is no easy solution, because if there was an easy solution, we probably wouldn't be in the difficult situation that we find ourselves in. But I think there isn't a single solution either. There need to be a variety of things that are deployed. As I mentioned, the dialogue, the listening, the making sure that policy is addressed in a way that is impactful at all levels, and that different parts of society feel that policy is being directed towards them. For instance, in the as part of the portfolio the Vice President is responsible for, which also covers demography, we're spending a lot of time reflecting on how to address the impact of things like depopulation, which in many parts of Europe, in Eastern Europe in particular, but not only, you have vast parts of countries where the population is decreasing. The member state the Vice President knows best, Croatia, has lost a considerable proportion of its population in the past 10 years. These have an impact not only on the economic performance, but also on the social realities of those who are left behind. So we need to make sure that when we talk, for instance, about a Green Deal and we talk about a digital transition, that when we do this, we bear in mind the impact that this is going to have across the board. There is no one size fits all. We need to make sure that the people who feel that they are at the bottom of the heap have a chance of being pulled up from that situation.
Okay.
But I certainly think that dialogue engagement is a very important part of it, and we need to emphasize it.
Okay, and Sue, your thoughts on that? I mean, I suppose just when Colin was talking there, I was thinking about the last election in the UK when Boris Johnson won a huge majority, thanks largely to parts of the UK which had felt neglected, the famous red wall seats. Whether their newfound admiration for Boris Johnson will survive the current moment is another debate. But just your own thoughts on what Colin has been saying and this issue of inequality and how that might, I suppose, shape how you approach a political debate.
Well, one of the things that shapes our work is the phrase that Jo used in her first speech in Parliament, which is that we have more in common than that which divides us. And that phrase doesn't deny the fact that everyone has different life experiences, and it doesn't deny the inequalities that exist, but it also shapes a lot of the work that we do. And actually reflecting on some of our hyper-local community-based work that we do, we've had real success in bringing people together who have on the face of it, very different views about many things in life, including about political views. But actually, if you can create spaces where people can come together and start having those discussions and start meeting people who are not like them and don't share the same views, you do find a way that you can build trust, as we've been talking about a lot, and you can build a sense of unity between people. So I don't really have a sense of how that plays out on a wider scale, but I think it is really important to remember that sort of intrinsically there is a lot that brings people together, and to find spaces where we can have those open discussions is really important.
Thanks, Sue. A question in from Skerto Gill, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Could the panelists say more about what constitutes respectful political discourse? For example, is it dialogue versus debate, supporting the other party's good ideas rather than insisting on opposition? I mean, I suppose the way politics is run in most countries is deeply entrenched and hard to, there are cultures of political debate and parliamentary debate that are hard to sort of overturn. So if you just want to pick up on that when you're nodding there.
I was going to reference one of the pieces of work that we've done at the Joe Cox Foundation, which is for the 2019 general election and the local elections that took place last year. We worked on something which we called the Pledge for a Respectful Campaign. And what we did was we shared that with all political parties, and we asked all candidates to sign up to it. And it's a really easy thing to do. It's something that they put on their social media. But that has at its core three things, which are that candidates say they will set an appropriate tone in their campaigning, that they will lead by example, and also that they will defend the dignity of others, especially their opponents. So just wanted to throw those three things in from that pledge, which I think do form the basis for when we talk about sort of respectful political discourse.
Timothy, can I bring you in there? What do you think of this idea about, like where you might get a foothold on more civil political discourse in a country like America? I mean, just in terms of the way political parties operate and how they approach social ideas, contentious ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. Actually, a few years ago, NICD had put forward some material to the commission that oversees the presidential debates around some kind of baseline kind of civility, and they didn't. The commission welcomed it. They said they couldn't speak about it kind of publicly because it would have caused this whole kind of hubbub, which I think indicates part of the problem is that we can't. For the moderators, for example, they were using some of this, but they didn't publicly speak about it because I think it indicates that, you know, there's a certain appeal, as was just being noted by a colleague of mine the other day. One of the things that exacerbates a lot of this is that some of our news organizations, for example, could lament some of this, but they make a lot of money off of this as well. CNN was one that was being recently kind of highlighted as, you know, having to navigate this push and pull of playing a role in society and at the same time being incentivized to kind of let the circus go on, right? Thinking about politics as such. Maybe a couple of things. One is that, you know, a comment a little while ago was, how do we think about these relationships? And there are lots of really good indications of governing with, right, of thinking about these institutions and people. And so back to this kind of sense of trust and relationship, I think that's one of the pieces here. That so that's one. And then the second one is a little bit more pointedly to your question is thinking about what do we even mean by civil discourse or civility? That book that I was mentioning earlier, A Crisis of Civility, we talk about civility as kind of this politeness, right? So these are a lot of those kind of norms, that kind of behavioral, the code of conduct, the Robert's Rules of Order, for example, in the United States, we use that as kind of the backbone. But a lot of that is the very superficial. It's what allows us to get deeper as the civility, as we talk about it as responsiveness, right? And so this is where I think the challenge is, how do we move from this kind of thin, weak notion of just being able to kind of get along, which is super helpful. Like right now, nobody's interrupting me speak. You might think what I'm saying is absurd, but well, I guess they're all muted, so maybe they can't. But right, at least on the panel here, right?
So, you're such a great moderator. That's why.
Yeah, well, exactly. You're doing super well. But this sense of being able to do that, even when you do have deep disagreement. The deep sense of civil discourse, though, and I think this is really worth noting, is that does include that thin notion, but it does mean protest, and it does mean kind of as some colleagues talk about it, you know, confrontation and the like, and so or this civil disobedience, and so broadening a little bit of what we even mean by this kind of civil political discourse is really important, because if we only turn it into the policing of you're saying the wrong thing, or you've said a certain word, or you're being dismissive, then we've lost, I think, the robustness and the elasticity that we need in a diverse society, right? We need to be able to kind of have this place for expansion and push and figure out where does it hit those outer boundaries of what really does push us beyond where we need to be, if in fact we're not only like lobbing kind of attacks and things at one another. And so when we talk about the social media and all these other kind of platforms and spaces where we often are, or where we're getting information, we have to be reminded of that, because those are fed by and continued by this kind of appeal of the extreme. And it's not so much about having everybody become somewhere absolutely in the middle and moderating every view you've got, because I think part of this diversity, we do want to have that range, that ideological spectrum, the policy differences and the like. What's really important is to figure out, and this is, I think, the real lament, is that there's not this kind of give and take relationship in a lot of governments at this moment. It's more about how do we push through our agenda, rather than say, that's actually a pretty decent idea. It doesn't align exactly, but we do have good examples. And again, I think the EU is doing really well on a lot of these fronts, certain governments, to say, we both agree on an end goal. We have different paths to get there, but how do we recognize that and allow us to see that end possibility, rather than not even start the journey because we're in a different location in that regard. And that, to me, is one of our fundamental problems when we talk about political and civil discourse.
Okay, just briefly, Timothy, if you may, to pick up on Colin's point there about instilling certain values at the level of school children. I mean, does that happen in America? Do school kids learn about the sort of precepts of democracy and civics?
Well, we're trying our darndest, and so I mean, so this is really important. As I've said, a few other things are also really important, but the sense of education, I think, is at the heart of this. if we think about civic education specifically, there are some of these efforts. One of the areas that I've helped develop is called Deliberative Pedagogy. And so we've really been looking mostly at universities and colleges, but there's a whole vein of this that's really looking at kind of youth education. So the K-12 language is what we use here in the States. And so fusing some of this dialogue deliberation into those environments is important, alongside the more kind of traditional kind of civics education. So who are my representatives? How does government work? All those sorts of things. All that's really important. And so that's not to be dismissed, but I think expanding a little bit of how we think about that as well, because it's not just us observing decisions being made. For us, and especially for youth, to see that government is of, by, for, as President Lincoln kind of famously said, of the people, right? By the people, for the people. And if we recognize that and see ourselves within it, and certain people elevate, I think there was one comment earlier, somebody made in the chat that, politicians are citizens and vice versa, right? And so we have to be really careful about how we create these distinctions of who are the political and civic actors in our lives. And if we recognize that, then all of a sudden that creates opportunity for, say, third or fourth graders, young children, I have young children, that they have a certain political efficacy, but learning about how to do that in ways that are engaging and civil and also confrontational when they need to be. And I think finding the ways to navigate those responsibly and reasonably is really important. But there are these efforts in the States. Circle at Tufts University is doing a lot of work around this. The Center for Information and Research on civic engagement, particularly for youth, is a gold mine for a lot of this. But the downside is these are the things that don't get tested in schools and the like. And so when we focus on science and technology and some of this, we lose these other dimensions. It's the thing that connects these other bits of social life. And that's a real problem if we don't recognize, and as we're seeing right now globally, one of the big challenges is if we don't have the understanding and the capacity to engage in that, then it's easy to watch some of that slip away because we haven't really been thinking about it.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Just a quick question from Regina Flynn, and a few people have also brought this up. Regina is surprised that nobody's referred to the role and practice of local, national, and global media, which stirs up polarization, negativity, and disrespect. I'm happy to take that question as a journalist. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem. I report for RTE News, which is publicly funded, and we have a very strict code of conduct and impartiality. And where there have been times where RTE has made some pretty horrendous mistakes in the past, those rules have been updated, and we take them quite seriously. I know quite a few people out there accused RTE of all sorts of things, but I guess some of the other panelists might want to just comment quickly on this. The local and national newspapers have suffered so badly financially that they have to get into the shark tank to survive financially, and to have clickbait and to push their, I suppose, the profile and complexion of their newspapers and outlets over to much more opinionated pieces, courting fairly toxic issues to get people riled up about. I mean, Colin, just to ask you briefly what you think the role of the media should be in trying to calm down the discourse and get people to be civil to each other.
First of all, I think we deserve to be able to have a media that's balanced as far as is possible. Of course, in a pluralist society, you're going to have different views and different agendas which are going to be promoted, including in the media. But what's worrying, and I think this is what the question also was speaking to, is the fact that increasingly the media space is dominated by less and less players. And that means that you're really having the independent voices very frequently, which are being squeezed out of the market, and that is extremely worrying. So what we try to do at the European level, although there are restrictions in terms of how far we can get, because it's also rules at the national level that apply, is to ensure that there is a freedom of choice, that there are standards to which media operators can be held to, But again, this also is linked to the whole idea of how the the general debate can be encouraged and can be held, and of course the media does play needs to play a role itself in doing that. It's not so much about causing or encouraging the media to act in a particular way. The media itself needs to also be able to regulate the way in which it can behave and can impact the broader discourse.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Can I just go to Sue finally, because I think we have to wrap up in a minute or two. Sue, of course, the media in the UK is perhaps famously partisan, and that trend, I think, has heightened in recent years. I mean, do you think that media space has something to answer for, especially in terms of the whole question of truth and integrity in reporting stuff? Where do you think that fits into the overall picture?
Well, before we started this call, I was having a look on Twitter just to see what was going on. And I noticed that #ScumMedia was trending. So I clicked to see what people were saying. And what we saw there was a real distrust, talking about trust again, of what people were saying about the way that the latest revelations about parties have been reported rather. So I think that yes, absolutely. What we were seeing there is a lot of people saying that they felt that what the BBC and the Guardian had been reporting on about the parties was not fair and not true. But actually, in reality, I don't think it was the BBC and the Guardian who have been breaking those stories. So I think there are some really entrenched feelings about who says what in the media that is down partly to that partisan nature that you commented on. Okay,
thank you very much, Sue. I am going to just wrap up now. And look, thanks so much to everyone who has sent comments and questions, and I'm very sorry we didn't get to all the questions or to read all the comments. That there are loads, but thanks for being part of the debate. I mean, it was a really fascinating discussion, and what I love about it is that we had a European view, a British view, and an American view, and a lot of the problems are familiar and common across the globe, and the solutions may also be find some kind of common ground. We've talked about trust, we've talked about how to get citizens more involved, and of course from an Irish perspective, deliberative democracy has been very successful. We've had 4 citizens' assemblies which have really helped to rewrite the constitution and to reform laws which have then had a lot of success at referendum level. So it shows that deliberative democracy can command the support of a large number of the population if it's done right. And I know that Colin has talked about the Conference on the Future of Europe in that context. So thank you so much to Sue and to Timothy and to Colin. That's been a really fantastic debate. So much to talk about, so much we didn't get to talk about. And I'd like to hand back over now to Sean Farron from the John and Pat Hume Foundation just for the concluding comments. Thank you, Sean. You're muted there, Sean.
Okay, that's it now. Thanks very much indeed, Tony, and special thanks to Colin, to Sue, and to Timothy for their excellent contributions. I think both in the Hume Foundation and in the Glencree Centre, we can feel vindicated in our decision to engage in this discussion. Obviously, it's one that will continue. There are many aspects of it that apply to our own situation in Northern Ireland, where despite the fact that our peace process is widely lauded in many places around the globe, nonetheless, there is at a rhetorical level, at a level of political discourse, there is a whole area to be addressed. We're very good at pointing to the mote in the other person's eye and failing to see the mote in our own eye, failing to put ourselves into the shoes of the others to see what their perspective is. And all that gets very sharply reinforced and exaggerated in the openness of the social media to people who want to abuse the others. And I'm interested in hearing from Colin and from Sue and from Timothy what the initiatives are that have been taken in order to address the abuse that the social media seems to be so prone to. But nonetheless, it's not my job to continue the debate. It's to continue, to bring the debate here today to a close, and to thank you, and to thank our friends in the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation for joining with us in the Hume Foundation. And the one word that I would like you to take with you from this is one that Colin cited at the very beginning, and that is John Hume's emphasis on respect for difference, difference being the essence of humanity, respect for that difference and celebrating the positives in the differences is an obligation that falls to us all. But my thanks on behalf of the Foundation and on behalf of the Glencree Centre to all the participants, to the speakers, and indeed to those of you in the audience who posed the questions. And we look forward to continuing this debate, this very important debate around the style and nature of public discourse and political education for our young people. Thank you all, and goodbye.